At 9:30 in the morning on June 3rd, 2026, a neighborhood in Tarzana, Los Angeles that most residents would describe as unremarkable in the best possible sense, the kind of place where people know each other's cars and wave from driveways, was shattered by a single emergency call. The voice on that call, according to law enforcement officials who later spoke to reporters, did not sound panicked in the conventional sense. It was not frantic or broken by crying. Instead, it carried something far more unsettling, a calm that had detached itself from reality entirely. The caller stated simply, "I am the Son of Man. I just killed the man of sin." Those words, soaked in biblical language yet stripped of any theological coherence, which set in motion a chain of events that drew detectives, paramedics, journalists, and eventually the entire entertainment industry into a story they were wholly unprepared for. Because the man who had been killed, the man now lay in the front yard of a Tarzana residential property with a stab wound to the chest, was not an anonymous neighbor. He was James Handy, 81 years old, a veteran of Vietnam, and one of Hollywood's most enduring working actors, whose face had appeared in well over 100 film and television productions across 5 decades. When Los Angeles Police Department units arrived within minutes of the call, they found Handy unresponsive in the front yard. Emergency responders began life-saving measures immediately on site before transporting him to a nearby hospital. But despite those efforts, James Handy was later pronounced dead. The scene itself was described in early law enforcement briefings as contained and not chaotic beyond the immediate area of violence, which suggested the act had concluded before officers even arrived. The suspect was identified quickly as a 44-year-old man named Michael Gledhill, the adult son of Handy's longtime partner, Wendy Gledhill. Michael had not fled. Surveillance accounts and witness summaries indicate he remained near the scene and surrendered when officers arrived, effectively closing the perimeter of the investigation within moments. Investigators classified the case early as an isolated domestic incident, narrowing their focus toward the dynamics inside the shared household, the history of relationships within it, and any underlying tensions that might explain how a quiet Tuesday morning became a crime scene. To understand what was lost that day, one has to step back and look at the life James Handy had built, not in the way Hollywood typically measures careers, with franchise ownership and award campaigns and magazine covers, but in the way most working artists actually live, through decades of quiet craft and remarkable persistence. Handy was born in New York City and came to acting in the late 1970s during the expansion of network television, with early work connected to the daytime drama landscape, including appearances tied to Ryan's Hope, a period when soap operas functioned as both training grounds and pipelines for character actors hoping to enter the larger machinery of Hollywood. It was not a star-making moment. It was the beginning of something more durable, a long, slow accumulation of credibility. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Handy settled into a very specific and valuable category of performer. He became what the industry sometimes calls a high-volume supporting actor, someone whose presence could be dropped into virtually any genre without disrupting the tone of the larger story around him. He played law enforcement figures, institutional professionals, quietly authoritative men positioned just outside the center of larger narratives. Casting directors returned to him repeatedly because he offered reliability, the rarest commodity in an industry that prizes novelty. Over the course of his career, his screen credits accumulated to somewhere between 100 and 150 appearances across film and television, a number that sounds modest until you consider that most working actors cycle in and out of visibility within a few years. Handy never cycled out. He adapted instead, moving from analog network television to high-budget studio productions to digital streaming-era content, without ever losing his employability in any meaningful phase. His television work placed him inside some of the most culturally significant dramas of their respective eras. He appeared in NYPD Blue, ER, The West Wing, Criminal Minds, and The X-Files, shows that collectively defined decades of American broadcast television and drew tens of millions of viewers at their peaks. His film work followed a similar pattern of quiet but lasting impact. In Arachnophobia, he portrayed Pete, a resident of the small California town overtaken by a deadly spider infestation, contributing to the sense of ordinary community life that the film needed to make its horror feel real. In The Rocketeer, the beloved 1991 Disney adventure, set in 1938 Los Angeles, He played Wooly, a figure operated within the criminal underworld surrounding the story's central conflict. By 1995, he had appeared in Jumanji alongside Robin Williams, playing a kind of authority figure, in this case a police officer, that audiences trusted to ground the story in institutional reality even as stampeding animals and monsoons tore through the town around him. What makes these appearances striking is not just their number, but their cultural longevity. Arachnophobia became a cult favorite revisited by horror fans for decades. The Rocketeer evolved into a touchstone of superhero history, beloved by a generation that has never stopped talking about it. Jumanji transformed from a single-family adventure into a multi-generational franchise, with sequels and reboots still in circulation. Handy was inside all of them, a quiet constant, a face whose presence told audiences that the world of the film was real and inhabited. More than 2 decades after Jumanji, he appeared in Logan, the 2017 film directed by James Mangold, in which Hugh Jackman delivered his final performance as Wolverine. Set in a bleak near-future America and deeply concerned with aging, vulnerability, and emotional cost of a life lived in combat, Logan cast Handy as a doctor, a small but thematically fitting role in a story about what happens to warriors when their bodies and their world begin to fail them. What makes these appearances striking is not just their number, but their cultural longevity. Arachnophobia became a cult favorite revisited by horror fans for decades. The Rocketeer evolved into a touchstone of superhero history, beloved by a generation that has never stopped talking about it. Jumanji transformed from a single-family adventure into a multi-generational franchise, with sequels and reboots still in circulation. Handy was inside all of them, a quiet constant, a face whose presence told audiences that the world of the film was real and inhabited. More than 2 decades after Jumanji, he appeared in Logan, the 2017 film directed by James Mangold, in which Hugh Jackman delivered his final performance as Wolverine. Set in a bleak near-future America and deeply concerned with aging, vulnerability, and emotional cost of a life lived in combat, Logan cast Handy as a doctor, a small but thematically fitting role in a story about what happens to warriors when their bodies and their world begin to fail them. Before any of that, before any camera had ever turned in his direction, James Handy went to Vietnam. He was drafted in his early 20s and deployed with the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, serving in Tay Ninh Province between August 1966 and July 1967, a period of intense ground combat operations during one of the most violent phases of American involvement in the war. In later interviews, Handy described conditions that resisted easy summarization. He spoke about the psychological disorientation of dense jungle terrain, near total darkness at night, and constant uncertainty about where enemy positions were. He described the fighting as sometimes so continuous that it blurred into routine survival rather than discrete battles. He spoke about watching fellow soldiers killed or wounded in close proximity. When he returned to the United States, none of that experience closed itself off and became the past. It became instead a permanent layer of his worldview, one that pushed him toward pacifism, and a deep discomfort with the way war was romanticized or simplified in popular culture. He was openly critical of Forrest Gump for what he saw as a sanitized and emotionally dishonest portrayal of Vietnam-era service, a critique that was controversial but entirely consistent with the through line of his life. His very first film credit, In Taps, a military academy drama centered on discipline and institutional authority, was already drawing on an understanding of those environments that no acting class could have provided. By the time production of Top Gun: Maverick began, James Handy had been a presence in American film and television for more than 4 decades. The film, built around Tom Cruise's return to his most iconic role nearly 40 years after the original, was one of the most carefully controlled productions in modern Hollywood history. Even small roles were cast with extraordinary attention, mixing established performers, real naval personnel, and experienced character actors who could populate the world without pulling focus from the central story. Handy was cast as a bartender named Jimmy, a brief and functionally atmospheric role, but a credited one. His job was not to drive a narrative, but to make the world of the film feel inhabited, which was something he had spent his entire career learning how to do. When Top Gun: Maverick was released after multiple pandemic-related delays, it went on to earn over $1.4 billion worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing films of 2022 and reaffirming Tom Cruise's extraordinary hold on global theatrical audiences. The film's extended cultural life cycle, driven by streaming resurgence, award season recognition, and international re-releases, meant that even minor cast members remained indirectly connected to one of Hollywood's most dominant commercial events. That is how James Handy's name became attached to a production that, years after its release, was still actively circulating in popular memory. At 81, Handy had settled into a quiet life in Tarzana with Wendy Gledhill, his longtime partner. Although never legally married, they had built what neighbors consistently described as a stable and familiar domestic life. Wendy's adult son, Michael, also lived in the home. Wendy later told investigators that Michael had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had discontinued his medication in the period before the incident. Mental health professionals who were not involved in the case, but who spoke generally to reporters, were careful about what conclusions they drew from that fact. Large-scale research has consistently shown that individuals with schizophrenia are statistically more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of it. Where risk does increase, clinical literature identifies a convergence of specific and conditional factors. Untreated psychosis in combination with paranoia, social isolation, and perceived interpersonal threat within a confined living environment. Forensic psychiatrists and researchers who study domestic violence often note that escalation in these situations is rarely a single dramatic rupture. It is instead the endpoint of a long process of accumulated stressors interacting with untreated illness in a closed household, where warning signs may have been gradually normalized over months or years. Neighbors who later spoke to reporters described having noticed changes in Michael's behavior in the period before the incident. They recalled withdrawn behavior, occasional signs of paranoia, and a general quality of disengagement from the surrounding environment. Wendy described her son and Handy as having maintained a cordial relationship despite occasional tension, a characterization that fits precisely within what researchers sometimes call the normalization of deviance. The way people who live in close proximity to escalating risk can gradually reset their understanding of what counts as normal until a crisis arrives that cannot be absorbed or reframed. The 911 call Michael made after the stabbing, in which he described himself as the son of man and described Handy as the man of sin, was treated by investigators not as a theological statement, but as behavioral evidence of a disturbed mental state. Forensic psychologists who reviewed similar cases in the public record noted that religious or symbolic language used immediately after violence often reflects psychotic distortion of reality rather than any coherent moral framework, a perception of cosmic significance attached to an act that has no such significance outside the speaker's collapsed internal world. Michael Gledhill was arrested and charged with homicide, along with an allegation of personal use of a deadly weapon. He did not appear at his initial arraignment in Los Angeles Superior Court, and no plea was entered. His attorney informed the court that jail authorities had not transported him to proceedings. Superior Court Judge John H. Reed ordered that Gledhill undergo evaluation through mental health court mechanisms to determine his competency to stand trial. Bail was set at approximately $2 million. The case remained in early legal stages, its human dimension already fully formed in a way that courtroom proceedings would take years to fully process. When news of Handy's death spread to the entertainment industry and beyond, tribute emerged from fans who had grown up watching his face in beloved films and from industry peers who understood the kind of sustained, invisible labor his career represented. The absence of instant high-profile public statements from major stars did not surprise those familiar with how Hollywood responds to the deaths of working character actors. Such tributes tend to come through private channels, union acknowledgments, and behind-the-scenes conversations rather than press releases. Tom Cruise's name began appearing in coverage almost immediately, given his connection to Handy through Top Gun, Maverick, and rumors quickly circulated online claiming that Cruise had broken down in tears, that he had issued a personal statement, that he had been in prior contact with Handy or had known something about the troubles inside that Tarzana household. Short-form videos circulating on TikTok and similar platforms presented what appeared to be emotionally charged clips of Cruise speaking about Handy, some of them featuring AI-generated or digitally manipulated footage. None of it was real. All of those videos were fabricated. The factual record is narrow and clear. Tom Cruise made no verified public statement about the death of James Handy. There was no documented emotional response, no confirmed mourning specific to Handy, no credible report of any personal connection beyond professional one created by their shared film credit. What the fabricated content revealed, perhaps unintentionally, was something true about the industry James Handy had served for 50 years. His death became visible in the news cycle largely through its association with a larger name, attached to a film that still lived in cultural memory. That is not a criticism. It is simply the arithmetic of how recognition is distributed in an industry built around stardom. James Handy spent his career doing something statistically far more common than becoming famous, and far more difficult to sustain. He showed up, role after role, decade after decade, in projects that needed someone they could trust to make the world of the story feel real. He did that across Vietnam and soap operas and cult horror films and superhero blockbusters and prestige television and a billion-dollar franchise, carrying inside him the entire time the memory of a war that never left him and a conviction that the truth of human experience deserved more honesty than entertainment usually gave it. When the morning of June 3rd arrived in Tarzana, that career ended in the front yard of a house where the weight of illness and proximity and silence had finally become too much to hold.